When war broke out in the Pacific in December 1941, Morotai and the narrow body of water, later known to Allied sailors as Morotai Strait, lay on the fringe of the main headlines. The island formed part of the Netherlands East Indies, administered indirectly through the Sultanate of Ternate, with an estimated pre-war population of about 9,000 people, scattered in small coastal settlements and villages inland. There were no large ports, no modern roads across the heavy jungle, and no major airfields. For the colonial authorities, Morotai was a remote outpost in a vast archipelago, whose main value lay in its position on sea routes rather than in its modest local economy. Geographically, Morotai sat just north of the larger island of Halmahera, separated from it by a channel only about 10 kilometers wide. This waterway, the Morotai Strait, opened southward toward the Molucca and Seram Seas, and northward toward the approaches to Mindanao and the southern Philippines. To Japanese planners considering how to secure a perimeter around their newly conquered territories, such straits were potential internal corridors, offering sheltered routes for convoys, coastal shipping, and later submarine and barge traffic linking New Guinea, Halmahera, the Philippines, and the Central Pacific. In Tokyo, the strategic framework for the southern operation was set before the first landings took place in December 1941. Japan sought to neutralize Western bases in the Philippines and Malaya, seize the resource-rich Netherlands East Indies, and establish a belt of island positions that would be defended by a combination of naval air power and garrisons along key sea lines. The occupation of Morotai in early 1942 formed a small part of this wider advance through the archipelago. Japanese units moved into the island as they overran the Dutch colonial structure in the region, extending control over anchorages and anchor points that could support subsequent operations, even if Morotai itself was not heavily developed or garrisoned at this stage. For the Allied side, centered on the American, British, Dutch, Australian command, the same geography posed a different problem. Their ships and aircraft needed to protect sea routes feeding Australia and India, while attempting to defend the oil fields of Borneo, Sumatra, and other parts of the Netherlands East Indies. Early naval clashes in adjacent waters, such as the battles in the Java and Makassar seas, reflected an attempt to interdict Japanese invasion convoys moving through the island chains. When those actions failed and ABDA was dissolved, Allied surface forces could no longer contest channels like the Morotai Strait on a regular basis. Control of this and similar passages passed effectively to Japanese hands in the first half of 1942, though often without permanent coastal installations. Local inhabitants experienced these changes not as abstract strategic moves, but as a rapid shift in authority. Dutch officials were displaced by Japanese military and administrative personnel, whose primary goal was to integrate the island into a broader network of outposts and supply lines. Existing subsistence agriculture and small-scale trade continued under new regulations and requisitions, while surveys of anchorages and potential airstrip sites were carried out with an eye to future operations. In this environment, Morotai Strait became a guarded but relatively quiet corridor, a route to be watched, patrolled, and occasionally mined or reconnoitered rather than an immediate battlefield. Its significance, however, was already defined by its position between Halmahera and the wider Pacific, setting the conditions for the naval and air actions that would develop there as the balance in the region began to shift after 1942. When hostilities in the Pacific began in December 1941, the waters around Morotai were initially shaped more by decisions taken in distant headquarters than by any local combat. Japanese planners in the Imperial General Headquarters designated the Netherlands East Indies as a primary objective because of its oil fields and its position between the Philippines, Malaya, and Australia. The Southern Army and supporting naval forces were tasked with advancing step by step through Borneo, Celebes, and the Moluccas, using each captured anchorage and airfield to secure the next move. In this sequence, Halmahera and the adjacent Morotai Strait were identified as part of an internal sea route linking forward bases toward New Guinea and the southern Philippines. On the Allied side, the formation of the American, British, Dutch, Australian Command in early 1942 reflected a hurried attempt to coordinate scattered naval and air units over a very wide area. Dutch colonial forces in the Moluccas were small, with the main concentrations of the Koninklijk Nederlands Indisch Leger, KNIL, and naval units committed to defending key oil and port installations, such as Tarakan and Balikpapan, and later Java itself. Australian and American ground units were sent to reinforce some airfields, notably Ambon and Timor, but no comparable buildup occurred on Morotai. As a result, local Dutch authority on Morotai consisted largely of civil officials and small police or militias detachments rather than a substantial garrison. The opening phase around Morotai Strait in early 1942 unfolded as part of the broader Japanese advance across the Netherlands East Indies, rather than as a separate named battle. After securing positions in the southern Philippines and northern Celebes, Japanese naval and army formations moved through the Halmahera Sea and surrounding channels, including Morotai Strait, to occupy islands that could support future operations. Contemporary accounts and later reconstructions agree that Japanese forces landed on Morotai during 1942, but they also indicate that the island had not been heavily fortified, and that the takeover met little or no organized resistance compared with larger actions at Ambon or Tarakan. For local inhabitants, this opening phase meant the arrival of small Japanese detachments by sea, rather than major fighting offshore. Vessels using the Morotai Strait were primarily transports and escorts moving between Halmahera and other islands, asserting control over the channel by presence and patrols instead of repeated engagements. Dutch administrative symbols, such as flags and offices linked to the Sultanate of Ternate, were replaced by Japanese military authority, while day-to-day life continued under new regulations and requisitions. In contrast, Allied personnel experienced this change mostly as a loss on the map and a contraction of the shrinking perimeter that ABDA could still defend, reinforcing assessments that peripheral islands like Morotai would have to be accepted as temporarily beyond reach, while resources were concentrated nearer to Java and Sumatra. In early 1942, Japanese strategic planning treated Morotai and the adjacent strait primarily as one element in the wider Netherlands East Indies campaign, rather than as an independent objective. The central aim of this campaign was to seize and secure the Dutch oil fields and associated infrastructure, while establishing a chain of sea and air bases from Malaya through Borneo and the Moluccas to New Guinea. Morotai's occupation in this context served to extend control across the Halmahera Group and to protect shipping routes that linked bases in the Philippines and Celebes with advancing forces toward New Guinea. Japanese naval and army staffs envisaged a network of convoy routes running through semi-enclosed seas and narrow straits, including the waters west of Morotai. Troop and supply transports moving between Davao, Halmahera, and points further east and south could use these channels, supported by local air units and sea patrols once nearby airfields and anchorages were secured. In this scheme, the Morotai Strait functioned less as a heavily fortified choke point and more as a protected link inside a growing perimeter, with Halmahera identified as the site for larger air installations and stronger ground forces. Allied planners within the American, British, Dutch, Australian Command approached the same geography from a defensive perspective. Their declared task was to maintain a Malay barrier stretching from the Malayan Peninsula through Singapore and the southern Netherlands East Indies, using naval and air power to contest Japanese troop convoys moving toward Java and the vital oil regions. In practice, this meant concentrating available cruisers, destroyers, and submarines closer to Java and key ports, accepting that peripheral routes such as the Morotai Strait could not be patrolled continuously once Japanese forces had advanced deep into the archipelago. Intelligence estimates on both sides shaped how much attention Morotai itself received. Japanese assessments indicated that Allied naval strength in the region would be sharply reduced after defeats in early 1942, particularly following the loss of the main ABDA surface force in the Battle of the Java Sea. This encouraged Japanese commanders to prioritize resources for operations against larger Allied bases, and for the occupation of islands with existing ports and airstrips, while Morotai remained lightly developed and held by limited detachments. Allied intelligence, for its part, recorded the spread of Japanese control through the Moluccas, but also highlighted the shortage of Allied aircraft and warships capable of sustained operations so far from Australia and Ceylon, limiting prospects for early counteraction in the Morotai Strait. Political and economic considerations paralleled these military calculations. For Japanese leaders, the consolidation of the Netherlands East Indies offered access to petroleum, bauxite, and other resources, as well as an opportunity to present the advance as the creation of a new regional order. For the Dutch colonial administration and its allied partners, planning centered on how to preserve or eventually restore control over territories now beyond their immediate reach. Local communities on Morotai and Halmahera observed these shifts largely through changes in administration, taxation, and requisition rather than detailed knowledge of convoy schedules or high-level strategic debates. But the decisions taken in distant headquarters defined how heavily the Morotai Strait would be used, guarded, and later contested. When Japanese shipping began to use the waters west of Morotai on a regular basis in 1942, the first clashes in and around Morotai Strait were limited in scale, but significant in what they revealed about the new balance of power. Convoys transporting troops, construction units, and supplies between Halmahera, the southern Philippines, and New Guinea moved mostly at night or in poor visibility, escorted by destroyers or smaller patrol craft. These formations did not face large Allied surface task forces in the strait itself. Instead, they encountered distant submarine patrols and occasional long-range airstrikes probing the edges of the newly established Japanese perimeter. Allied commanders, operating with reduced resources after the collapse of the American, British, Dutch, Australian command, relied increasingly on submarines based in Australia and on long-range bombers flying from northern Australia or remaining forward airfields. Submarines patrolled approaches to key islands and straits, including the routes leading into and out of Morotai Strait, seeking targets of opportunity among Japanese transports and tankers. When contact reports suggested convoy movements near Halmahera or Morotai, small groups of aircraft were sometimes dispatched to attempt attacks on shipping, but the range and limited numbers of aircraft meant that many sorties ended as reconnaissance rather than destructive raids. For the Japanese forces tasked with securing the channel, the first engagements consisted as much in detection and escort as in direct combat. Naval staff sought to adjust convoy routes and timings to reduce exposure, while placing lookout posts and small detachments along likely observation points on Morotai's coast. Anti-aircraft weapons, where available, were concentrated near anchorages and makeshift jetties, rather than dispersed along the entire shoreline. Reports of submarine activity in adjacent seas led to incremental changes in routing and escort composition, but without a decision to abandon Morotai Strait as a transit route. Local inhabitants experienced these developments as a gradual militarization of their coastal environment. Areas previously used for fishing or small-scale trade were placed under restricted access when convoys were expected. Some men were conscripted as laborers to extend piers, unload cargo, or help build storage areas near sheltered inlets. Air raid alerts, when Allied aircraft appeared over surrounding waters, disrupted daily routines, but did not yet translate into sustained bombing of villages as targets of primary interest were ships and temporary military facilities. The first confirmed losses associated with Allied attempts to contest the route tended to involve individual Japanese cargo or transport vessels damaged or sunk on approach routes to Halmahera, rather than in the narrowest part of the strait itself. In such incidents, crew casualties could range from a few dozen to over 100 personnel, depending on the size of the ship and the severity of damage, while Allied submarines risked depth charge attacks that occasionally inflicted damage but rarely resulted in immediate loss of the boat. These exchanges underscored the asymmetry of the contest. Allied forces could strike selectively, but could not maintain a permanent presence, whereas Japanese forces controlled the coastline, yet had to accept some attrition of shipping. Morale on both sides reflected this pattern. Japanese sailors and soldiers in the area operated under the assumption that their side held overall initiative after successive victories in early 1942, but reports of submarine attacks and sporadic air raids introduced an awareness that the sea lanes were not completely secure. Allied crews, fighting in small numbers far from their main bases, measured success in terms of individual ships struck or convoys disrupted rather than control of the strait as a whole. For civilians, the early engagements in and around Morotai Strait marked a transition from distant news about battles elsewhere to a more immediate awareness that the war could appear suddenly in the form of aircraft overhead, or explosions at sea within sight of the coast. As 1942 progressed, the character of activity in and around Morotai Strait shifted from rapid conquest to consolidation under pressure. Japanese forces, having occupied Morotai during their advance through the Netherlands East Indies, began to integrate the island and the strait into a more structured network of sea routes and minor bases, supporting movements between Halmahera, the southern Philippines, and New Guinea. The channel's narrow width, about 10 kilometers between Morotai and Halmahera, made it suitable for controlled convoy passage, but also exposed any shipping to observation from both coasts. For Japanese commanders, the main challenge in the second half of 1942 was to move personnel, fuel, ammunition, and construction materials through this and similar passages, while escort resources remained limited. Destroyers and small anti-submarine craft were needed across a wide front, from the South China Sea to the approaches of New Guinea. This forced compromises. Some convoys through the Morotai-Halmahera area sailed with only a few escorts, while others relied on timing, weather, and the relative remoteness of the route for protection. Reports of submarine sightings or air reconnaissance occasionally led to rerouting or to changes in departure times, but the route itself remained in regular use because it linked several important staging bases inside the Japanese-controlled perimeter. On the Allied side, the crisis took a different form. After the dissolution of the American, British, Dutch, Australian Command in early 1942, operational responsibility shifted to new Allied structures based in Australia and India, which had to decide how far into the former Netherlands, East Indies, their forces could still operate. Submarine commands extended patrol lines northward from Australian bases into the Halmahera and Mindanao sectors, establishing operating areas that would later include Morotai Strait and adjacent waters. Long-range bombers and reconnaissance aircraft flew intermittent sorties over island chains and sea lanes. But fuel limits, aircraft numbers, and competing demands in New Guinea and the Coral Sea constrained how often they could search or strike in the Morotai region. By late 1942, overall shipping losses in the wider theater indicated that the maritime war was entering a more attritional phase. Japanese records and Allied analyses both noted increasing attacks on troop and supply convoys across multiple sea lanes, prompting refinements in convoy routing and tighter coordination between naval and air units on escort duty. In practical terms around Morotai, this meant more systematic use of zigzag courses, stricter radio discipline, and adjustments in sailing schedules to reduce the chances of being detected at predictable locations and narrow passages. These measures did not eliminate risk, but they reflected an acknowledgement that previously uncontested routes could no longer be treated as secure. For civilians on Morotai and nearby coasts of Halmahera, the same period brought an escalation in demands without the dramatic battles seen elsewhere. Japanese authorities expanded labor requirements for constructing storage areas, improving small jetties, and maintaining roads and tracks leading to coastal points used by military units. Restrictions on fishing zones and coastal travel increased whenever convoys were expected, and rumors of submarine attacks or airstrikes in surrounding seas circulated through villages long before most inhabitants had any direct contact with Allied personnel. To local communities, the crisis therefore appeared as a tightening of regulations and an intensification of military presence around a strait that had once been simply a waterway between islands, but was now firmly embedded in the logistics of a wider, slowly escalating war. The period from mid to late 1942 marked the height of operational use of the Morotai Strait within Japan's expanding defensive system. While no single large fleet engagement was recorded in this narrow channel, shipping density and the level of military organization around it reached their highest point of the year. Japanese convoys moving personnel and supplies between Davao, Halmahera, and staging points for New Guinea operations increasingly treated the strait as part of an internal corridor, one link in a chain that supported campaigns at Buna, Gona, and elsewhere along the Papuan coast. Escort patterns, signal procedures, and local security measures were refined to keep this route functioning despite growing Allied pressure in adjacent seas. In practice, the peak around Morotai Strait was visible in the rhythm of convoy traffic. Transport groups of several thousand tons total capacity, typically combining a few cargo or troop ships with one or more warships on escort duty, transited the channel in both directions. Northbound sailings moved units, equipment, and wounded or sick personnel back toward Halmahera and the Philippines. Southbound and eastbound movements carried reinforcements and materials required for operations in New Guinea and the Solomons. The strait's narrowness and its position between Morotai and Halmahera reduced exposure to open ocean conditions, but created predictable tracks that Allied submarines attempted to exploit where approaches widened to the north and south. Japanese high command decisions concentrated combat power at more prominent fronts, such as Guadalcanal and the Bunagona sector, which meant that units based near Morotai and Halmahera had to secure an important transit area with comparatively limited aircraft and escort vessels. Local naval commands coordinated with air units from nearby fields on Halmahera and other islands to provide occasional cover when intelligence suggested possible Allied activity. But continuous air patrols over the strait were difficult to maintain. This led to a pattern in which some convoys enjoyed aerial reconnaissance and cover for part of their passage, while others moved under shipborne lookouts and radarless escorts relying on visual detection and hydrophones. Allied forces operating from bases in northern Australia and New Guinea increasingly regarded any traffic through the Halmahera Sea and adjacent passages as part of a single logistical system, sustaining Japanese forward positions. Submarine flotillas assigned patrol zones near these routes recorded contacts with convoys estimated at 2 to 5 transports plus escorts, attempting torpedo attacks where depth and sea state allowed. Long-range aircraft, including medium and heavy bombers configured for maritime strike, sometimes flew missions that brushed the approaches to Morotai Strait, using sightings of smoke columns or radio intercepts to plot convoy movements. The most intense phase of this activity coincided with Allied efforts to cut reinforcement routes to New Guinea in the second half of 1942, though not every patrol produced an engagement. For personnel directly involved, this peak period brought a sustained operational tempo, rather than single decisive clashes. Japanese sailors and soldiers experienced repeated convoy voyages through the same confined waters, with drills for air and submarine attack forming part of routine discipline. Allied submarine crews, operating at distance from their bases, measured their contribution by ships engaged and tonnage claimed across the wider region, knowing that even partial disruption of supply lines through channels like Morotai Strait could influence outcomes in battles fought hundreds of kilometers away. Civilians on Morotai and Halmahera saw the cumulative effect in more frequent ship movements, stricter coastal controls, and occasional distant explosions or fires at sea. Signs that the war's most intense fighting might be occurring beyond the horizon, while the strait itself functioned as a heavily used, intermittently contested artery within a larger campaign. As the maritime war in the Netherlands East Indies settled into a longer campaign, both sides adapted their methods around routes that included the Morotai Strait. Japanese commands responsible for traffic between the southern Philippines, Halmahera, and New Guinea adjusted convoy procedures to reduce losses. Sailing schedules were increasingly tied to moon phases and weather forecasts, with more passages timed for overcast nights. Ships were ordered to form smaller, more frequent convoys instead of larger, infrequent ones, where earlier experience had shown that a single successful submarine attack could inflict higher aggregate losses. Crews drilled in damage control and rapid blackout procedures, treating the narrow waters around Morotai as areas where a brief warning might make the difference between a damaged and a lost vessel. Escort tactics changed as well. Where depth and navigation permitted, destroyers and smaller anti-submarine craft began to sweep likely submarine approach lanes before convoys entered them, dropping depth charges on suspected contacts and forcing submarines to remain deeper and less effective. Lookout posts along the Morotai and Halmahera coasts were assigned responsibility for reporting any aircraft or suspected submarine wakes, using simple signal systems to warn approaching ships. In some stretches, barges and small craft were grouped into local shuttle services, moving cargo between anchorages inside the island chain, rather than sending larger transports through the same waters repeatedly. Allied forces, observing patterns in Japanese traffic through intercepted radio messages and submarine patrol reports, also modified their approach. Submarine commanders refined their patrol lines to cover the broader approaches leading into the Halmahera Sea, rather than waiting in the most obvious narrows alone. Torpedo usage shifted toward carefully prepared night attacks against convoys identified by earlier reconnaissance, with fire control practices adjusted based on experience from early war failures and mechanical problems. Air units experimented with different search patterns over the island chains, balancing coverage of areas such as the Bismarck Sea and the waters near Halmahera, and coordinating where possible with submarines to exploit confirmed sightings. Within this framework of adaptation, Morotai Strait functioned as one node in an evolving network, rather than an isolated battlefield. Japanese engineers incrementally improved small jetties, fuel dumps, and storage areas near sheltered coves, using local timber and imported materials to support longer-term use of the island. These installations remained modest compared with larger bases, but represented an attempt to stabilize logistics in an environment where Allied attacks on open ocean routes were becoming more frequent. At the same time, the need to conserve fuel and shipping capacity meant that not every proposed improvement could be implemented. Commanders had to decide which sites along the route merited scarce resources. Civilians on Morotai and nearby coasts adapted in more basic ways. Fishing fleets adjusted their operating areas in response to new restricted zones and the risk of being caught near a convoy movement. Some inhabitants were employed as pilots and guides, using their knowledge of currents and shoals to help military crews navigate in poor visibility. Others were drawn into labor units working on roads, depots, and piers, reshaping village economies around military requirements. Information about Allied attacks elsewhere reached the islands through official announcements, rumors carried by sailors, and occasional observation of burning ships on the horizon, shaping local expectations about the war's direction without providing a complete picture. Morale among Japanese personnel using the strait reflected the mixture of confidence and caution that came with adaptation. Reports of successful deliveries to New Guinea and other fronts reinforced a sense that the logistics system still functioned, but ship crews were aware that every passage through constricted waters carried a measurable risk. Allied submariners and air crews, for their part, recorded incremental improvements in their ability to locate and attack convoys, yet also faced long patrols with no contacts and the constant possibility of counterattack. In this setting, resistance and adaptation did not take the form of a single dramatic stand in the Morotai Strait, but of continuous adjustments by navies, air forces, and local communities, trying to operate within a channel that had become an important, if largely unseen, segment of the wider 1942 campaign. By late 1942, developments far beyond Morotai and Halmahera began to alter how both sides viewed the waters of the strait. The sequence of Japanese campaigns in New Guinea and the Solomons had initially been supported by relatively steady convoy flows through multiple island channels, including the route that passed west of Morotai. As Allied air power expanded from bases in New Guinea and the southern Solomons, however, attacks on shipping increased along the broader arcs of movement that these convoys had to follow. Losses in surrounding seas did not necessarily occur inside Morotai Strait itself, but they changed the risk calculations attached to every leg of the journey, including this narrow channel. Japanese naval planners responded by reassessing which routes could still be considered relatively secure internal waters and which had effectively become frontline zones. The Morotai Halmahera passage, once treated as a sheltered link within a wide perimeter, was now evaluated in terms of its vulnerability at the approaches north and south, where enemy submarines and aircraft could strike. In some cases, planners shifted more traffic to alternative routes, even when these required longer sailing distances, while reserving the Morotai Strait for convoys judged essential to ongoing operations in New Guinea. This did not remove the channel from use, but it marked a transition from routine employment to more selective, risk-aware deployment. On the Allied side, the same period brought a growing appreciation of how interconnected the Japanese logistics network had become. Intelligence from signals interception, aerial reconnaissance, and submarine patrol logs indicated that ships using the Halmahera Sea and related channels were part of the same system that supplied frontline positions facing Allied forces at Buna, Gona, and later along the northern New Guinea coast. The turning point for planners was not a single engagement at Morotai, but the realization that sustained pressure on convoy routes across a wide area could influence land battles by limiting reinforcements and resupply. Patrol patterns and target priorities were adjusted accordingly so that sightings near Morotai Strait fed into broader operations designed to thin out Japanese shipping over time. For those directly involved in transits through the strait, this shift was reflected in changed expectations rather than a visible, one-day transformation. Japanese crews sailing the channel in late 1942 did so with more detailed briefings about possible air and submarine threats, stricter enforcement of blackout and radio silence, and more frequent drills for evasive maneuvers. Allied submariners and air crews, in turn, regarded any contact in the wider Halmahera sector as part of a strategic effort to erode Japanese maritime strength, even if an individual patrol produced only a single attack opportunity, or none at all. Civilians on Morotai and Halmahera noticed an increase in caution around shipping movements, tighter restrictions on coastal access, and occasional suspensions of local activity when convoy schedules or threat reports demanded it. In retrospect, the period toward the end of 1942 can be seen as the moment when Morotai Strait's role shifted from that of a relatively quiet internal passage to a segment of a contested supply network. No formal declaration marked this change, and contemporary documents did not describe a named battle limited to the strait. Instead, the turning point lay in the accumulation of evidence that even remote-seeming channels were now subject to systematic attack, and in the corresponding adjustments by Japanese, Allied, and local actors who recognized that the security of these waters could no longer be taken for granted. By the end of 1942, the character of activity in and around Morotai Strait shifted again, this time toward a more dispersed pattern of operations that formed the aftermath of the year's campaign. Japanese authorities did not abandon the route, but they reassessed its relative importance compared with other passages in the Netherlands East Indies. Some convoys that had previously used the channel routinely were diverted to alternative tracks farther west or east, while shipping that continued to pass. Morotai did so on schedules shaped by changing threat assessments and fuel considerations. Local garrisons on Morotai and nearby coasts of Halmahera were maintained, yet some specialist units and equipment were redeployed to fronts where immediate ground fighting demanded more direct support. For Japanese naval and merchant personnel, the end of 1942 did not bring a formal cessation of danger, but a change in its distribution. Ships that had previously transited the strait as part of larger movements to New Guinea might now be assigned to different routes or tasks, and convoy commanders incorporated lessons from earlier months into standing instructions. Vessels that had survived multiple voyages through narrow channels carried records of minor damage repairs and loss of crew members to earlier sinkings elsewhere along the route, reflecting an accumulative pattern of attrition rather than a single decisive loss linked solely to Morotai Strait. Shore detachments continued to operate lookout posts and small facilities, but daily routines increasingly included preparation for the possibility that Allied air power would expand further into the region. Allied forces experienced the aftermath in terms of shifting operational priorities. Submarine commands evaluated the results of patrols that had covered approaches to Halmahera and nearby seas, comparing the tonnage sunk or damaged with that achieved in other areas, such as the Bismarck Sea and Central Solomons, where analysis suggested that attacks on convoys near New Guinea offered greater opportunities to influence ongoing land battles. Some boats and air units were reassigned, leaving fewer assets available to patrol approaches that fed into Morotai Strait. Other submarines continued to pass through the wider area as part of longer patrol patterns, so the threat did not disappear, but it became one element in a broader Allied effort to limit Japanese shipping across multiple theaters. For local communities, the immediate aftermath of the 1942 campaign was visible in modest but cumulative changes rather than in sudden devastation. Some coastal villages had lost boats or dwellings to requisition, storms, or isolated air attacks on harbors and anchorages. A small number of civilians were killed or injured when caught near military targets, or when mines and unexploded ordnance drifted or washed ashore. Fishing and small-scale trade were still possible, but increasingly regulated, with designated lanes and times that aligned with military traffic. Access to certain stretches of coastline remained restricted, particularly where jetties, storage areas, or lookout posts had been built to support continued use of the strait. The withdrawal phase also had an administrative dimension. Dutch colonial structures had been displaced earlier in the year, and by late 1942, Japanese military and civil authorities were working to integrate Morotai more firmly into their regional governance systems. This involved adjustments in taxation, labor obligations, and the use of local intermediaries, including traditional leaders whose positions were reshaped by the new hierarchy. For the Allies and the exiled Dutch administration, the island and its strait were recorded primarily as occupied territory within a contested maritime zone, one of many locations to be addressed in future campaigns, rather than an area where they could immediately return. Thus, by the turn of 1943, combat operations specifically associated with Morotai Strait had diminished in intensity without disappearing altogether. The channel remained a functioning, if more cautiously used, component of Japanese logistics and a secondary focus for Allied interdiction. The visible consequences included altered shipping patterns, modest infrastructure on the coasts, and a population whose economic and social life had been reshaped by military demands, even though the most dramatic battles of the Pacific War were occurring elsewhere. In the longer view of the Pacific War, the events of 1942 in and around Morotai Strait became part of a larger pattern rather than a standalone campaign. Later, far more visible operations, including the 1944 Allied seizure of Morotai Island itself, drew attention away from the earlier phase when the strait functioned mainly as a conduit for Japanese convoys and a secondary focus for Allied interdiction. Many post-war narratives mention Morotai in connection with the construction of large air bases used for operations toward the Philippines, while the 1942 phase appears mostly in convoy tables, submarine patrol reports, and scattered local recollections. For Japanese planners and veterans, the logistical use of Morotai Strait in 1942 formed part of a wider experience of operating long, exposed sea lines of communication. The lessons drawn from this period contributed to later adjustments in convoy doctrine, escort allocation, and route selection across the Netherlands East Indies and beyond. The relatively modest scale of documented losses in the immediate vicinity of the strait did not diminish its significance as one of many channels whose continued usability allowed forces in New Guinea and other fronts to receive men and supplies, even under growing Allied pressure. Allied records preserved the strait primarily as a reference point in patrol grids and intelligence summaries. Submarine and air units that operated in the Halmahera sector viewed any successes there as contributions to a cumulative campaign against Japanese shipping, rather than as elements of a discrete battle. In later analytical studies of the Pacific Maritime War, Morotai Strait appears as one node in the wider effort to restrict Japanese mobility by targeting transport routes, demonstrating how interdiction could influence distant land battles by constraining logistics rather than by engaging large fleets directly in a single location. For the inhabitants of Morotai and neighboring coasts, the legacy of 1942 was measured in altered settlement patterns, economic shifts, and memories of occupation that preceded the more intensive developments of 1944. Some communities retained accounts of forced labor on jetties and depots, changing administrative structures, and sightings of damaged or burning ships offshore. These local perspectives offer a complementary view to operational histories, showing how strategic decisions made in distant capitals translated into changes in work, movement, and authority around a narrow body of water that had previously been a routine part of daily life. In historical debates, the 1942 activity in Morotai Strait is sometimes cited as an example of how wartime terminology can suggest discrete battles, where the underlying reality was a series of movements, attacks, and adaptations spread over months. Researchers examining shipping logs, war diaries, and oral histories use the area to illustrate the continuous incremental nature of maritime warfare in archipelagic regions, where geography produced many such confined channels. The Strait's experience in 1942 therefore contributes to broader understanding of how seemingly minor routes, garrisoned lightly and fought over indirectly, formed an essential substrate for larger campaigns that shaped the outcome of the Pacific War.